In this video, I'm going to be modeling for you how to round a number to the nearest 100. Now, if you've already practiced rounding to the nearest 10, you're going to notice that it's very similar, except we're going to be focusing on the hundreds place, the hundreds benchmarks, and then the hundreds midpoint. So again, benchmarks, midpoint, and then remembering those rounding rules. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. 362, I'm going to make my number line, and then since I'm rounding to the nearest 100, I'm going to focus on this hundreds place, 300. 362 is in the 300s, so 300 is our starting benchmark. So now I need to figure out what the next 100 is. And if I'm not sure right away, I can just do a quick skip counting of 100, 200, 300, 400. So there are my benchmarks. Now I need to find my midpoint. Just like with rounding to the nearest 10, the midpoint ended in 5 because 5 is right in the middle of 10. Our midpoint for the hundreds is always going to end in a 50 because 50 is the midpoint of 100. So we just have to remember it's not just 50, it's 350 for this midpoint. So now that I have my benchmarks and my midpoint, I'm going to put my number on the number line. You can put a star, you can write your number. Now I need to think, my number's right here and it's after the midpoint. Midpoint and my number's after it. So it's going to round up to the next benchmark. Let me do another example here for you. So 150, looking at that hundreds place. 150 is in the 100s, so my first benchmark is 100. Now my next benchmark would be 200. And again, that midpoint is 50s, so it's 150, right in the middle there. My number is the benchmark, or is the midpoint. So remember, if you are the midpoint, it always is going to round up to the next benchmark also. Always, always, always. Let me do this example down here for you. This one can be a little tricky sometimes. 27, remember this is hundreds, tens, and ones, so 0 hundreds right now. So my first benchmark is actually 0. The next 100 is going to be 100. My midpoint is 50. And then my number 27 is about right here. So it's before the midpoint, so it's going to round actually to 0. This example right here, 627. So rounding to the nearest 100, 600 is my first benchmark. My next benchmark is going to be 700. And then right in the middle is my midpoint of 650. Now my number is about right here, 627, and it's going to round, since it's before the midpoint, it's going to round down. And you'll notice 627 and 27 both rounded down because they were before that 50s midpoint. Now I do want to show you one thing that we do work on in 3rd grade. We'll take the same number and round it to the tens place also. So let me model that for you. If I'm going to take 627 and I'm going to round it to the nearest 10, I have to then remember this time I'm now focusing on the tens place, the tens benchmarks, and the tens midpoint. So here, my tens, it's in the 20s, so it's going to be a benchmark of 620 because I'm now going to round to the nearest 10. So my next tens benchmark is going to be 630. It's like 10, 20, 30. Well, it's just 620, 630. My midpoint, those are those 5s again. Got to remember that. 625 is my midpoint. Now, 627 is about right here. It's after the midpoint. It's about right there. So it's actually going to round up. And so now you need to notice something. This same number, first of all, rounded to 600 when we did the hundreds, to 630 when we did the tens. And if you notice, here it rounded down, and here it rounded up. And that's because of what you're focusing on. Here it was before the midpoint, whereas here it's after the midpoint. And that's because here this range is much larger. It has 100 in range, whereas this one is only a range of 10. So it can round in different directions based on what you're focusing on. So go ahead and remember when you're rounding, whether it's to the tens or the hundreds, focus on that specific place value and then find those benchmarks and those midpoints.